This is CLIL discussion 16, hard and soft CLIL teacher skills, recorded on February 16, 2011. All right, then let me set the agenda, because we've got discussion 16, hard and soft CLIL teacher skills. It's quite a mouthful, but it is something that's been quite popular in your messages to me, at least. And there was a request that we kind of try and continue with this defining and differentiating between the two groups of teachers, soft CLIL teachers and hard CLIL teachers, and at the same time talk about skills. A couple of you were quite enthusiastic that we pick up skills and talk about skills. So I put them together, and I hope that's okay. So we've got a question. Basically, I just threw in a guiding question. Is it more important to be good at English or to be good at teaching? And I'm playing devil's advocate because, of course, I think we'd all agree on a good answer to that. But I'd like to hear what your bits and pieces answer to that question is. You know, what are those good skills, and how much language I've put later as a bullet point in the agenda. What are those skills specifically, and how much language is enough or too little? Because I must admit, in the context I've visited, the level of teacher language has varied a great deal, but at the same time, the level of activity, the difference of activity and interaction in the classroom has also varied, not dependent on the level of language of the teacher. Are there defining characteristics for soft CLIL teachers and defining characteristics for hard CLIL teachers? Perhaps we could just list them, you know, because I think John made a comment in a previous discussion. We should be offering very simple bullet point lists of the things we talk about. I agree with that a lot. And I've also put in some excerpts from Jeremy Mahama's blog, where he's been defining soft and hard CLIL, and offering some comments from people who write into his blog about CLIL, namely, a lot of people talk about what the advantages are for language in CLIL, but there isn't a lot out there saying what a great way CLIL is to teach a content subject. And here they mention physics or geography or maths, and I wondered if you had comments about that with reference to CLIL teacher skills. Now, would anybody like to get the ball rolling, or should I do that? You're always very quiet when I say that. It's the same in the classroom when I ask my students.
Well, I'd like to start because I'm not a native speaker. I'm a science teacher, and I'm not a language teacher. So soft means for me be a little bit soft with the language and focus on the content and try to bring language to the content.
Andreas, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I'm not quite sure. Are we talking now about the difference between soft and hard, or are we talking about teacher skills and language skills? I wanted to start off by saying something about language skills and teaching skills. Although I'm a language teacher myself, I think that teaching skills are much more important than the language skills in CLIL. I know that many of my colleagues, that means language teachers, are rather skeptical about that, because they feel that many CLIL teachers, so I'm talking now about scientists or engineers, are simply not good enough at languages to do a proper job. But I think most of them are definitely good enough. And what the big challenge is their teaching skills, because they need to be diversified, they need to be improved, they need to have a much wider spectrum of different methods available to become really good CLIL teachers.
You're talking about the language teachers now?
No, I'm talking about the engineers and scientists, who usually do not have too much of didactics and methodology at hand, because it's not part of their education and training. The language to most of them comes quite naturally. Many of them have worked in international environments before, but it's about methodology, about different approaches to teaching, and that's what they need to work on.
I travelled on a train with Christian Dalton-Puffer in Austria last year, and we talked about this very issue, specifically within Austria. Now, in Christian Dalton-Puffer's book, Discourse in Content and Language, she has some, I think, 50 hours of lesson transcripts and identifies what happens with the language in these classrooms. And one of the comments she made to me on our train journey when I asked her about the nuts and bolts of the research, she said, well, in most classrooms, the focus on language that I talk about a lot in my workshops and presentations in conferences doesn't tend to happen in CLIL classrooms in Austria. It tends to be that the teachers have a level of language that they can function in successfully, and they do what they would normally do in their mother tongue. What's your reaction to that, Andreas?
Yeah, well, so I know bits of what Christiane has written in that book, and actually one of my classes has been a subject of research as well for one of her works. The problem definitely is that many of the engineers or science teachers are still used to a very traditional kind of teaching. That means the teacher speaking most of the time, not really too much interaction going on with the students. And when those teachers started out using English as language of working language or language of instruction, they were just, let's say, translating what they did do in German before into English, but they did not change their methods of teaching. And that's why I think there's got to be much work to be done when it comes to methodology. And
I mean, in the Austrian context, Andreas, would you? I'm sorry for interrupting you, but I think this is relevant for all CLIL contexts. You know, are you aware of research at all done in Austria which measures achievement in these classrooms? Because I suppose the bottom line is going to be how successful the students are in those traditional CLIL classrooms. And by traditional, I mean which don't necessarily pay attention to language and support language and scaffold language. Are they still successful anyway, these students?
Yeah, they are definitely still successful. There's pretty wide research available, which has been done by Christiane as well, which is a study about CLIL in Austrian technical colleges, and it is on the one hand, it's interviews being done with school management, teachers, students, and graduate students a couple of years after they left school. And they were asked questions like, do you think you profited anything from those CLIL lessons? And most of them totally agree that it's, of course, especially the language skills, they profited a lot. It made them much more flexible when using the language. It made them more at ease when using the language. It's probably not so clear when it comes to, let's say, profits concerning the subject itself, which does not mean that they learned less. The question is, did they learn more? And I say we cannot really say that.
Yeah. Well, let me throw in a reference to a research paper I've just read, and I'm going to summarize and post about on the Fat World site, and that's from Aini Christina Jeppinen, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, from University of Jyväskylä, which actually does research content achievements with an experimental group of CLIL students in English, French and Swedish, with a control group of Finnish mother tongue learners of the same subject, maths and science. And the research is quite interesting that they state that CLIL teaches as well as and sometimes better than mother tongue groups, the same subject.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, national characteristics vary greatly, but it is a piece of research which does pick up on this very question. You know, can you teach the content in a foreign language to the same level?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Keith, can I come in there?
Phil, please.
Yeah, because that's very clear from the Basque Country context as well. The plurilingual project that's been going on here since 1991 in the Castolas in the private schools here proved that very clearly. When the first graduates who began at 4 in the multilingual context, that's in the 3-language project, Basque, English, and Spanish, got to 2002. They were tested in various things. They've been tested for 10 years. This is a major external evaluation by the University of the Basque Country right from the beginning, and they were tested on not IQ so much as general cognitive levels on their Spanish and their Basque levels and their English levels, and then on top of that they were tested in social science, because the first graduates of the system, as it were, studied social science through the whole academic year. They did the Basque curriculum, but it was in English, and that's where I'd come in with writing the materials. Yeah. And they were tested at the end of the year on all these things. And the most interesting thing is that the social science results, they were tested against, like in Euskara, they were tested against native language control groups who'd done history, the same content, but in Basque throughout the year. And the results are very clear. The experimental group, the ones who did it in English, got better results. And it wasn't only that; they didn't only get better results. They had to do the exam in Basque, of course, but that was also very interesting. They did the whole year in English, but they had to do the test in Basque for obvious reasons in the control group. They not only got better results, but the exam was designed in such a way as to test certain cognitive skills, and the control group almost got as good a results in rather more basic history questions. I can't go into the complex theory here, but rather more basic ideas of memorizing and giving facts. And in the other part of the paper, the students weren't aware of it. They were being tested more on social science skills, more history skills, if you like. And the experimental group who had done it in English got massively better result. The average result was in general better. We tested this again this year, just to prove that it wasn't a false result. This is 8 years ago. And again, the result, again, the English results are better. The people who've done it in English got better results. Not quite as good as last time, but still better. So, there are results from elsewhere as well.
Well, in a way, those stories about, we've referred to Austria, Spain and Finland, are a very good setting onto which we can talk about what those skills are then, because, if we talk about a traditional approach which is very teacher-led and filling empty vessels-led, what is the alternative that we're claiming CLIL is all about? Perhaps we could enumerate some of those skills.
Yeah, well,
we're still trying to bring people in. Phil, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think it probably relates, obviously, to the previous discussion where several people already implied, haven't they, that if you're, in a sense, if you're not working in a transmission mode sort of context, and if you no longer can work in a transmission mode context, then you realise that it's less about teacher language and more about student learning. So you become more of a facilitator, and the language that you need may still be technical, but it's funny that the language that the teacher needs becomes often more functional in those cases than actually than technical, let's say, than more cowpish. So the actual kind of language the teacher needs is also distinct. I think the teacher still needs to be confident, but it is a bit related to that. But obviously, it's also related to the fact, as has already been implied that when you realise that students can't necessarily understand by default, you shouldn't assume that anyway. But when you realise that they can't, because it's another language, you tend to be much more careful about your methodology, and that was the first conclusion we came to.
When I met Christiane, I'd given a presentation about communication in content classrooms, and during the workshop, she did pick up and say that teachers don't do this. Teachers are not setting up for example, a gap in information in order to force communication on a content subject. And I mean, I would put setting up a gap in information in terms of material design in that portfolio of CLIL teacher skills that I'd like to get us to attempt to list. You know, materials design, which includes communicative approaches to language learning for the content classroom, I think is an essential skill for CLIL. But it turns out that in a lot of classrooms, teachers are achieving results without developing and applying those skills to much extent.
I think in Dalton Puffer's book that's the case. It's rather strange, the book, in some ways. It's as if the lessons that she observed, the teachers were almost kind of improvising. Well, I'm doing it in English now, but there was a lot of translanguaging going on. It didn't seem really that there'd been much emphasis put on methodology in that context. And I think that Christina was looking at different things. She was looking at the kind of way that the dialogue took place between if there was any kind of difference in the way that people were speaking. She wasn't really looking too much at the methodological paradigm, if you like. Whereas I think on our project we realised that we had to change the way the teachers operated because they were working now in a third language, and so I think that was very much the emphasis here. I think Christina's research was slightly different in that sense.
I totally agree with what Phil says. You've got to take into account that when Christiane did the research for her language discourse paper, was a couple of years ago, and it was at a time when I think many of us had not really realized what CLIL was actually about. In those times, we still thought it's English as a working language. And the focus was on language, and it was not so much on methodology. And in the meantime, I think the approach has been changed, and more people come to the conclusion that it's not about the language only. And if I want to become a good CLIL teacher, it's not only language development that I've got to focus on, but it's development in methodology as well. So it might well be that if Christiane did research like that nowadays, or let's say in 1 or 2 or 3 years into the future, then the results might look different.
Yeah. There are some characteristics offered by Jeppinen in her paper, which we might pick up on just to expand, perhaps with experience from our own backgrounds. And what particularly struck me was she describes 4 key characteristics to these differences between the mother tongue context classroom and the CLIL classroom. The first of those characteristics is what's described as a large zone of proximal development. And in terms of a large zone of proximal development, there are some examples given, and one is specifically supportive materials. And this sort of caught my attention because I find I'm attracted to trying to produce supportive materials for teachers whose classrooms I visit. And I like that kind of thing. I think I'm a cutting and pasting kind of teacher, and I always have been. And CLIL for me is about finding ways for teachers to find shortcuts, if you like, with their own subject material into providing those supportive materials. So I would say listing supportive materials within a very accessible form for teachers when they're being trained helps them apply them in their own practice in the classroom. And that might have, for example, if you've got a very text-heavy textbook, how can teachers break it down into core language in front of the teachers? Maybe perhaps before the lesson for creating their own resources, but also within the lesson when they're working with text-heavy textbooks, which happens quite a lot. How do you get to the core language? And for me, that takes a bit of practice to highlight parts of sentences which we want learners to then pick up and make their own when we ask them to produce the language of a content subject. So I suppose it's about identifying language as much as producing resources that practice language. I went on a little bit there, but do you see what I'm getting at? I think identifying core language is a key CLIL teacher skill.
I know what you're getting at, Keith, and I think that I was going to come in there and say that you know, we often, when you talk your initial question, people tend to react to that by saying, or by assuming that you mean what's the linguistic level of the teacher, you know, whereas in fact there's a whole other issue, isn't there, as you say, that a teacher can actually be very competent in a foreign language but have absolutely no idea about discourse, you know, about the actual discourse within his or her subject and the impact it has on a subject. It's, you know, there's so much else that has to be taken into account apart from simply the teacher's language level. You know, if a teacher speaks the target language well, then, you know, it's a kind of start, isn't it? But if they don't, well, as we said before, what we prefer to see is a methodological repertoire. But absolutely, it's also about the ability of a teacher to perceive and to understand discourse theory and a whole discourse. I mean, text type. It's tricky. It's tricky. Even English teachers don't understand it.
It is very difficult. I think it's very difficult indeed, but it is crucial. It's one of the things that. I mean, there's no point in providing any support until you know what you're providing support for. And if you want to, if you ask what you're providing support for, you have got to look at your lesson in language terms and see what kind of language demands it makes in terms of, you know, classical language skills and so on. And it is a very difficult thing to do. Teachers are not trained to do it, and subject teachers may well feel that. It requires a lot, perhaps even too much of them in terms of language knowledge. But it is important. It's basic.
Yes. I think, it's Wendy here, I think that's why Keith's geography and science books are so crucial, because they give some activities which actually help the learners conceptualize, and that's absolutely crucial to find, you know, to make sure that the learners have got a clear idea of the concepts that the teachers are introducing. So you do need those frameworks, and I think that's exactly what Keith's 2 books do. So he needs to make some more.
Yeah.
Yeah. I keep talking to the publisher about maths.
Yep.
You know, one day maybe we get a maths vocabulary book
Yep.
out. And I think in a way, you know, what we can do here is because the vocabulary books that Wendy mentioned themselves assume a certain skill set in the person who wrote them, and they each took me about 6 months to compile. So one is a heck of a lot of time to sit down and analyze core language in any given subject. I know that you wouldn't actually list that in a skill set for teachers, but we can say that teachers need time to analyze the discourse of their subjects. And types of language within their subject. You know, the vocabulary books are divided into tasks that look at word level, sentence level, and longer text level chunks of language. You might look at, subject-specific terminology, language that's shared across the whole of the learning curriculum. All of these are aspects of language that we can't always assume that CLIL teachers have in their repertoire, and they need to be made aware of those differences and the scope of language that their subject involves when it's in a foreign language.
Yeah. It'd be very nice to have resource books which do that. You know, it'd be nice for somebody to write resource books which look at a subject like maths and on the basis of regularly used maths textbooks, for example, look at the sort of subject-specific vocabulary of maths, the sort of general academic vocabulary of maths, the kind of teacher talk that maths teachers use, the kind of writing tasks that are set in maths, the way that maths textbooks are set out and the kind of reading demands they make and the kind of connectors that are used and the kind of genre. It would be useful to have basic sort of query, a language query like that for CLIL teachers to use, so they don't have to do it every blooming lesson, and reinvent the wheel.
There's a slightly bigger umbrella, John. You've done some great work on that discourse stuff. I mean, there's a slightly bigger umbrella. When you look at subjects, I mean, you've done it as well, I know. But when I worked in social science here, and still am doing, and we tried to base the English syllabus on the demands that were being made in the social science. Now, this is going back to soft CLIL. This is where I think we came up with a valid model of soft CLIL, and we're still developing it. But I'm worried about soft CLIL in general. We're sort of avoiding it. But what happened was that we found out in the social science, in the history, for example, 15-year-olds, that it wasn't so much lexis-led or language-led as so much as concept-led. And so, what I mean. It's what you tend to find in social science is that people compare a lot, and there's a lot of cause and consequence, for example. So when you have cause and consequence in geography and history, whereas you don't have cause and consequence quite so much maybe in chemistry. I don't know. So what you tend to find is you get cause and consequence types of language, and it's not only lexis; it's often syntactic as well. It's grammatical, and that's what we mean. And so what we found out was that we started developing English units parallel to the history course and the geography courses, which involved this kind of language. It wasn't simply lexical. I mean, if the word whereas, for example, seems to be quite common in social science discourse, but you can't form a whole unit for two months on whereas. So what you would do, we would work on units which brought in whereas naturally, if you see what I mean. And it seems to be an interesting model. That's our soft CLIL model, and it's taken from exactly what you're saying.
I've observed, it's Noreen here. I've observed some teachers whose language levels are quite low, but the skills they have are teaching skills, and it's knowing what questions to ask themselves and what questions to ask the students and what the big questions are and how to break down those bigger questions into smaller ones. That way, it is simply not a matter of lexis. You then get ideas, the concepts, and it gives you a wider framework. And the teachers I've observed whose language levels are not high, they tend to work when I've asked them how they do it, they say it's about the questions and the answers. It's looking for the questions. It's looking for the unusual. And they look at the big questions, and then they break it down into smaller questions. And that often forms their framework. I saw a maths teacher once teaching a lesson, and it was a brilliant lesson. Then I tried to talk to him after the lesson, and he didn't have enough language skills to engage in conversation. And then I asked through a translator how he managed to teach the lesson, and he said, I look at what the students need, I look at what I need to say and do, and I learn it. Which, to me, says something about his skills as a teacher, and he was looking at it through a prism of communication. And the learning was through that prism, and the light was certainly all the questions. So for me, that's a major skill that a teacher needs to have.
Is it worth referring to the Malaysia project?
It was in Malaysia that I saw this teacher, yes.
Okay, and I know that project, that program actually for English medium maths and science did produce scripts for teachers to use if they wanted them.
And it was
complete lesson scripts.
Yes, and it helped him, but he then went away and expanded on that. It's very prescriptive, and it will only work in certain contexts, but it certainly gave someone a framework, something to hold on to, which made him feel more secure and confident.
Well, I keep thinking about my niece who's here with us in Bulgaria, learning German in a Bulgarian school. She's English, and the teacher makes them memorize lots of chunks of stuff, within which there's a lot of lexis and a lot of grammar from a broader topic. And I think the idea of teachers learning scripts from a language learning point of view is a very good one. It sounds very old-fashioned of me to say that, but I think it gives them a support on which to expand, as you mentioned, Noreen, and develop beyond a basic script. That's certainly what my niece is doing. Can we carry on with, in a way, we're talking about subject teachers a lot, and I'm really happy to do that. But Phil did move towards soft CLIL a little bit, and I'd quite like us to try and differentiate between the soft CLIL world and the hard CLIL world in terms of teacher skills, because listening to Phil talk about soft CLIL within Spain and the idea of language lessons which shadow subject lessons, so that English teachers can consolidate concepts and language that's going on in the subject lesson. I like that definition of soft CLIL, and I think it's one that we can develop and grow. Actually, I feel less attracted to the soft CLIL definition, which says soft CLIL is when language teachers bring in some contents into their classrooms, which is, I think, a little bit what Jeremy Harmer was highlighting in his blog, and that opens the gate. It creates a risk of CLIL being painted with, well, it's just the repackaging of task-based language approaches to learning, and I don't think it is. And I think actually the kind of curriculum facilitator through English language, which is, I think, what's come in a lot of schools in Spain, is one which I've got a lot of time for, whereas the other one, which looks at task-based approaches to learning language, is very relevant and very valid, but I don't think that's CLIL. I think it's already been done.
No, I agree absolutely, Keith. I didn't want to monopolise that point, but I mean, I think that there's a real problem with soft CLIL, and Jeremy, I don't know whether Jeremy's trying to highlight it or not in that blog, but I think there's a huge problem, and I think it's a very simple problem actually. The idea that if you're an English teacher and you want to bring in a bit of content, I mean, I don't like that phrase for a start. I mean, what is content for a start? There's a whole swathe of problems associated with the word content. And there are all types of content anyway. And before we even look at that problem, the fundamental problem of soft CLIL seems to me that if you're going to bring content into your class, then how are you going to assess it? And it seems to me that very, very few soft CLILers have come up with an answer to that question. It's not their fault, but they haven't come up with an answer to it. It's obvious that in the model that I've described, you can assess it. But if you don't assess let's say the conceptual content that you're bringing in, whatever percentage it is, to your language class, if you don't assess that, then obviously you're onto a bit of a disaster, because your students aren't really going to be interested in it, because they know in the end that you're not assessing them on global warming, you're assessing them on the second conditional, which is required to, or on modality, which is required to speculate about global warming. I came out with a thing when I was in Uruguay about that, when I was trying to explain to them the difference, and I said, look, in CLIL you would study global warming in order to save the world. In soft CLIL you would study global warming in order to be assessed on modality, and the world will die.
That's good. Can I just come in there though, Phil? I mean, the thing about, whatever you call soft CLIL, the thing is, I tend to work mainly with teachers who are just teaching subjects, and they're doing it through English, and it's a huge struggle when their English isn't very good and their kids' English isn't very good, and it tends to work when their English is okay and their kids' English is okay. But I mean, in Italy, for example, what they tend to do is, and you probably call it soft CLIL. I'm sure subject teachers do some of their subject hours in English, and in doing so they work together in close collaboration with language teachers, and you get very good collaboration between teachers. And the thing is, everybody likes it, and it's really good, and it's very good for their language. It isn't particularly important for their subject knowledge, and I think very often the subject knowledge is not actually assessed. I mean, coming back to your point about assessment, but the thing is, those projects, those highly collaborative projects where two teachers work, for a period of maybe 20 weeks, with a science teacher working with a language teacher, and the kids doing science, partly science in English, it tends to be very, very motivating for everybody, for the kids, for the teachers. It tends to be good for their language. it isn't particularly orientated towards their subject knowledge, and it's probably not particularly necessary for their subject knowledge. But it does work within its own, within its own frame of reference. Mm-hmm. So it's something that I tend not to have too much to do with, but when I see it working, it's great.
In a way, the collaboration itself means that the language teacher is moving into the content curriculum, though, John, doesn't it?
Yes, that's true.
When they work with a buddy like that, they are looking at concepts and they are looking at skills that happen in the science lesson, for example.
Yes, they are. Yeah.
Try and incorporate that into the language lesson. So, in a way, I would go as far as to say that context of Italian paired up language subject teachers, which is very widespread in Italy, really is part of the soft CLIL definition. Because
it is. Yeah.
They're paired up, and the curricula are brought together rather than a language teacher in isolation.
Yeah. The thing is, it's low risk, because if kids don't understand the subject, the bit of the subject that's taught in English very well, they're going to get it in Italian. So it's a low risk from the subject point of view. It's a low risk enterprise. But from the language point of view, it's normally a very successful enterprise, and from the motivational point of view too. But it isn't what Phil is talking about. What I tend to spend most of my time doing. It isn't teaching subjects through a second language.
Is it simply about learning?
Sorry?
Is it simply about learning and experience, and that collaborative effort is hugely motivating for everyone?
Yeah. But we mustn't confuse it with, what you're doing in Qatar, Noreen, which is jolly well trying to get good levels of, trying to help teachers to get good levels of science and maths through the medium of English. It's just a very different activity, but teachers tend to do it. I mean, I think one of the reasons why they do that in Italy is because they can't do hard fill, because their subject teachers don't have the language skills. I think if their subject teachers had the language skills, they would be doing full-blown, full curriculum teaching of subjects through the medium of English, and that would be then a very different kettle of fish.
It sounds like that's on the agenda in Italy again, doesn't it? I think
it does.
We mentioned it in the discussion.
It does. Yeah, it does.
The government's decided to let students choose a foreign language medium subject for their school leaving year.
Yeah.
I can't remember exactly the details, but it's on the agenda. So they will have to find somehow subject teachers with that level of language to deal with that final year of their students in school.
Yeah.
I think what worries me, John, is English teachers worldwide, whatever. Again, back to Jeremy Harmer point, is English teachers are basically being paid to teach language, in crude terms, and so when you start dabbling with content, whatever they mean by that, I assume they mean that by topical, conceptual content. When you start dabbling with that conceptual content, you use that, in a sense, you're using it as a vehicle to teach a language. You're using it as a vehicle for the underlying linguistic objectives, if you like. And I think that unless you're very skillful at doing that, and you make it look as though you really did care about global warming, and then you test them on. I mean, everybody has to assess. You can't get away from it. It might be continuous or it might be summative assessment, but everybody has to do it. The language teacher has to prove that she is earning his or her money. And so the incorporation of content, I think, is a problem in soft CLIL. Whereas before we were talking about the incorporation of language knowledge for subject teachers who have it very clear in hard CLIL, in strong CLIL. There's no confusion, is there? We're trying to teach concepts and procedures. That's it. The language is a vehicle to do that. But in soft CLIL, it's tricky. It's tricky.
Yeah.
I met a colleague in Spain recently who suggested that you can create a definition of CLIL which incorporates language teachers by allowing language teachers to become teachers of ethics, civics, citizenship, I mean, in Bulgaria, for example, once upon a time, language teachers did teach about America and American society. Yeah. That was part of their skills base, if you like. And I suppose, for me, it still comes back to the nuts and bolts, the language, the skills, and the concepts. And if a teacher is dealing with language skills and concepts in the same matrix as we talk about a subject teacher dealing with foreign language skills and concepts, I'd call them a CLIL teacher.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
But I don't think that happens very much, does it? And those places where we still do have history and society type language courses, I'm making a very broad generalization. I think they're still very traditional where that happens.
I think it starts to move into one of those C's of Doe Coyle's 4 C's, doesn't it? The famous culture C. If you can somehow make a body of content, perhaps, which is identifiable as that particular C, then you might be able to give your soft CLIL as far and wide some kind of weaponry. Yeah. I could see that. Yeah, I can see that possibility. I don't think it exists massively at the moment, but I can see it.
So where have we got to? I mean, it's 10 to the hour. I was looking back at my notes. I think I thought about this too simplistically, in suggesting that we create a list of bullet points of descriptors for soft CLIL teacher skills and hard CLIL teacher skills. I'm afraid that's the way I think, and I apologise for it. But nevertheless, we've had a great discussion, even though we don't have the outcomes that I was thinking of. And I think that's always the case. Can we talk a little bit, just to end up with, about this question of how much language is enough? Because we talked a little bit about differentiating between soft CLIL teachers and hard CLIL teachers, and the area of overlap. But what about your experience of enough language? I mean, Noreen gave an example of quite an extreme context where, nevertheless, the teaching seems to be successful. Do you have examples of where the level of teacher language is formalized in your experience? I know, for example, in Holland, they have a very high benchmark of English language, which I think is C1 for recognition for as a bilingual school. When these schools apply for recognition as a bilingual school, they have to put their teachers through language courses, and they sit exams. I wonder what the case is in other countries.
Well, may I come in here? So in Austria, if you want to become a CLIL teacher, you don't need any language certificate at all. It's actually school management who's responsible for deciding whether the language skill of a certain teacher, whether the skills are good enough or not. Honestly said, it's the teachers themselves who say, yes, I dare do it, or no, I don't dare do it. From my research, most of the teachers, so in our courses, we ask teachers to have a look at the, for example, self-assessment grid for the Common European Framework to find out about their own language skills. And most of them say, well, I feel that I'm on a B1 plus B2 level, depending on whether we are talking about productive or receptive skills. When being asked where they want to go to, so what their aims are concerning language development, almost all of them say, well, a B2 plus level is the minimum which I'd like to achieve, because then I feel secure enough and confident enough to do the job. But most of them, they'd like to have even higher levels, like let's say C1. But once they've started doing it, they very much experience that it's not about perfection in language, because they see that their students are not perfect, they are not perfect. It's a kind of give and take in content on the one hand and in language on the other hand.
I think this matter of accuracy is really important, and I think the accuracy of language. And I think a lot of teachers who are asked to do CLIL, and let's say, I think the truth is a lot of teachers are told that they will start to do CLIL, and the extreme is when you memorize a script before your lesson, which is the example that Noreen gave. I don't think too many people are going to do that. And that must be very frightening as well, the idea that you have to script a lesson in that detail. I mean, I can imagine writing a lesson plan with your script to help you, but to actually memorize a script beforehand is almost like a drama, like a play. And I can see that teachers would get very anxious if that was the expectation. With second language teachers of English, second language users of English teaching other subjects, there's going to be a lot of error in their language. But again, what are we going for? The accuracy of the language or the content? It's that finding the balance between the language and the subject. Is comprehensibility the first goal, and then focus on the accuracy later?
Yeah. It is a matter of balancing a lot of things out, isn't it? I mean, and it's very difficult to say what the bottom line is. I mean, certainly, I'd prefer to have a teacher whose English was not perfect at all, but who had very good CLIL methodology and could teach that subject very well in a highly accessible and comprehensible way to kids whose English language ability was fairly low. Rather than a teacher who was an English fluent teacher, but when they stand in front of a class and the kids don't understand them and can't speak and can't write it, so they don't know what to do. So, there's a balance to be made there. But I think also the balance between teachers whose English is reasonable and who can teach their subject, but who are well supported by an English language teacher next door who is very good at teaching English and very good at orientating the English towards the demands of the CLIL program.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that would, the stronger that teacher is, the more it's possible to overlook flaws in the language of the subject teacher. But if that subject teacher has no support at all from the language teacher next door, who is simply not involved in the project, then all the burden of responsibility is on the subject teacher to get both the subject and language right, and it's very difficult to do that. So there's a sort of structure and management question here as well.
Yeah, I agree.
And I mean, one more thing to be said about structure and management. I mean, I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name of the colleague from Austria. Is it Andreas?
Yep.
Were you the one that was saying that teachers self-select? They decide whether they can dare to do it.
Yes, that's the case here in Austria.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good way of doing it, to be frank. And most teachers, very often teachers, if they're in that position, they will be able to do it. They'll be able to make an accurate assessment of their own ability to do it. However, once you're in Qatar, where Noreen is, and every blooming teacher in the country is required to do this, suddenly the situation is very different indeed, and the pressures on those teachers are huge. There's a massive difference, in other words, between self-selected teachers, self-selected schools, and very often in Europe, where it works, and system-wide projects like Qatar or Malaysia, where it struggles.
Can I just mention a TTO school in Amsterdam where the teachers do self-select, and it is up to the management of the school to say yay or nay to whether or not they can be a CLIL teacher. There was an incident once where a teacher had assessed himself to be rather higher than the management thought he was on the scale of language.
Interesting, yeah.
And that was quite interesting. He was told that perhaps he needed another year to gain his confidence and then go into the CLIL, which I thought was quite supportive. And he was given classes and support and someone to help.
That's great.
Is really the other extreme from the Malaysia example I gave you.
Did they find that? Did they find that out before he started his subject teaching in English, or did they find it out later?
They found it out later.
Yeah. I mean, maybe one needs some kind of probationary period where teachers have to prove themselves.
Yes, I think that's ideal.
Yeah.
Well, what's happening here is that because it's quite the project here, it's sort of quite linear, it's quite diachronic, and so the schools are coming in, schools come into it over a period of time. They don't all come in at the same time. So when a school comes in to the project here, the kids start at 4, and then elsewhere in the Basque Country there'll be a school where they've just gone into the 16 or 15. So if they come in at 4, then basically if the school is well organised, it says to the secondary teachers, look, in 7 years' time, you will be required to do this in English. You know, if you want to do this in English, go for some lessons now. If you want to improve it, and it actually changes. It changes and develops in many ways the internal organisation of schools. It's some people run away from it, but most people face it as a challenge. It's very interesting.
That's interesting. That's taking a long-term view of it, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it is. Yeah.
I think.
In a way, sorry.
I was going to say, I imagine that Teresa Riley in the Spanish bilingual project, I think they take a long view of it like that.
They can do that as well. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's there to stay, and so people know it's coming. They get their staff prepared for it. It's more.
Yeah.
Although what I would hate to see happen is something that happened in Hong Kong, where it was actually the English teachers who were benchmarked. But in such a vicious way. They were benchmarked for English, but in discrete language skills. Nothing to do with their teaching and how they were teaching, their methodology, but just in their English ability. But at a level that was something like applied linguistics level. I mean, that was just not appropriate at all.
No, you're right. That's. I mean, in a sense, it's just a kind of minimum requirement, if you like. We wouldn't benchmark them in that way. I mean, I think that would have been a government thing. On the project, we would just make sure, are you at the level where you're confident to do it? And if we felt they were, we'd let them. And then, of course, they get training with us in the methodology. But the Hong Kong system was a bit brutal. I heard about that.
Yes, and that's politics.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Listen, we've reached the hour, and I've made a few notes about scripting, which I'll try and find out if the ETEM's website still has links to its scripts, because it'd be quite useful to put in a reference to an example, of what a scripted lesson looks like. But let's draw it to a close, because we've covered quite a lot, and we did manage to get through everything on our list. And as always, I don't want to keep you longer than the time we said we would talk for.